contention is regional stability. Currently, the Middle East is in turmoil. Lucina of the Wall Street Journal in late 2017 finds that Saudi Arabia and Iran have been locked in a war for geopolitical influence with devastating consequences. These two powers have unleashed their wrath through proxy conflicts. Goldenberg of Foreign Policy in 2017 explains that in the past 7 years, nearly every major conflict in the Middle East has included Iran-Saudi influence from Iraq to Syria to Yemen. This competition has acted as the gasoline causing these conflicts to explode. Unfortunately, the Red Cross in 2018 writes that from the conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen alone, 50 million people are in need of aid and 19 million people are displaced. As it stands, however, Saudi Arabia and Iran show no signs of productive engagement. Tusi of Princeton in 2018 writes that tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia have reached such a point that prospects for dialogue, much less a diplomatic breakthrough, are extremely dim. From Cusack's 2016 Global Risk Analysis reported that these deteriorating relations will be acutely felt in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, as the prospect for finding a resolution to these proxy conflicts will be slim. However, ending U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia will improve regional security in 3 ways. First is preventing the militarization of proxy forces. According to the Congressional Research Service in 2002, historically U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia have dramatically increased the level of military technology in the region, and Iran has sought weapons in response as well. Unfortunately, this arms buildup allows both Saudi Arabia and Iran to transfer weapons to support proxies, escalating existing conflicts. Dunn of the Carnegie Endowment in 2018 furthers, finding that arms sales invite a counter-reaction from opposing forces, feeding civil wars. Dunn concludes that this ensuing flood of weapons has made Middle Eastern conflict lengthier and deadlier. As such, Moore of the University of Central Oklahoma in 2012 quantifies that a 1% increase in the volume of arms transferred to the government during a conflict predicts a 28% increase in the duration of the conflict. Second is moderating Saudi Arabia. Wesman of the Stockholm Institute in 2018 explains that the perception that military force can be effective, along with further arms acquisitions, may embolden the Saudi leadership to view the use of force as an increasingly central part of its foreign policy. Panade of the University of Miami in 2017 explains that due to U.S. protection, Saudi Arabia has seen itself as invincible and become more courageous in its foreign policy moves through proxy wars. Specifically, Panade concludes that these provocations in Qatar, Lebanon, and Yemen have only served to further destabilize the region. As such, Primus of the Journal of Peace Research in 2018 quantifies that arms imports empirically increase the probability of conflict onset by 21 percentage points. Third is rescuing Yemen. Thrall of George Mason in 2018 explains that Saudi Arabia does not have a large domestic defense industry to sustain an extended conflict, making them reliant on arms imports to continue their operations in Yemen. U.S. arms sales have become key. As Patterson of CNN in 2018 finds, the U.S. accounted for 61% of major arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Specifically, Benjamin of the Global Exchange in 2018 writes that the U.S. supplies aircraft and munitions for Saudi airstrikes and combat ships for the blockade of Yemeni ports. Because Saudi Arabia has directly targeted civilians and infrastructure, Maxwell of NC State in 2018 concludes that 20 million Yemenis are facing severe food shortages and more than 1 million have contracted cholera in the largest ever recorded outbreak of the disease. Importantly, Cavalry of the New York Times in 2018 explains that neither Russia nor China could fill the void left by the United States, as it would cost a fortune and require years of retraining, reducing Saudi military power for a generation. Thus, Abdul of Foreign Policy in 2018 furthers that Saudi Arabia could not continue their military campaign in Yemen without U.S. military support. Ultimately, Maggi of the Associated Press in 2018 concludes that the 5 most prominent international aid organizations jointly stated that the U.S. halting military support to Saudi Arabia would save millions of lives in Yemen. That's your turn.
Mitigate, resolve the United States should end its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Our sole contention is subduing the Saudis. Since 2015, a civil war and humanitarian crisis have raged in Yemen. Unfortunately, there are 2 main reasons these conditions are set to endure regardless of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. First, the United Arab Emirates. By 2018 of the Brookings Institute writes that the United Arab Emirates is a more active player in Yemen and would remain involved even if Saudi Arabia were to completely withdraw. Indeed, Griffin 18 of Arrest finds that the UAE does the heavy lifting in Yemen with the most advanced military, as the Saudis serve a support role. As such, the brunt of the offensive will continue with or without the Saudis. Second, economic leverage. Walsh 18 of the New York Times writes that while the media has been focused on the direct military operations of the region, the Saudi-led coalition has engaged in economic warfare against Yemen, denying salaries to civil servants, producing banknotes direct to currency, and engaging in a partial blockade that has driven up food prices. The result has been a rapid economic collapse that has heightened the risk of widespread famine. Fortunately, by maintaining our arms sales, America is able to leverage our influence to alleviate the conditions on the ground. Jerome 10 of the Council for Foreign Relations writes that arms sales buying Saudi Arabia to the United States provide a unique ability to influence Saudi decision-making. This leverage manifests in three key ways. First, by mitigating civilian strikes. Rogan 18 of the Washington Examiner writes that absent U.S. pressure, Saudi Arabia would use a major moral obligation to avoid civilian casualties while targeting complete groups. Indeed, part-time 18 of the Security Assistance Monitor writes that American pressure forced the Saudis to accept $750 million in training to avoid civilian casualties. Thus, Algebra 18 of National Interest writes that while civilian casualties have not disappeared, American pressure has been successful in reducing the overall amount of casualties and bombings of innocent civilians. This is why Rogan concludes that thousands more civilian lives would be lost without U.S. armistice. Second, creating windows of aid. Rogan 18 of the Washington Examiner writes that if America stops supporting the Saudi coalition, Saudi Arabia would have no interest in pursuing peace. He continues that the only reason Saudi Arabia stopped its deadly offensive in the Yemen city of Hodeida and engaged in talks was American pressure. These negotiations are rapidly reducing the conflict in the region. Wintour 19 of The Guardian explains that despite a couple of limited violations, current peace talks have ended Saudi airstrikes and offensive operations, thus putting the country on the path to peace. Indeed, Fasihi 19 of the Wall Street Journal furthers that peace talks have dramatically de-escalated violence through allowing aid to flow into Yemen, thus saving over half of Yemen's population from the brink of starvation. Even short-term peace talks have dramatic effects, as Biden 18 of Lawfare quantifies that many Yemenis teeter on the edge of survival, meaning short-term spikes in prices of food can be the difference between life and death for millions. Third, by solidifying Saudi initiatives. Miller 18 of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace writes that the U.S. has leveraged its arms sales to force Saudi Arabia to support American aid initiatives across the Middle East. For example, Young 18 of the Middle expertise that the U.S. coerced Saudi Arabia into ending its blockade of Hodeida and allowing the development of humanitarian aid planes intended to help the poor in Yemen. Overall, Carafano 18 of the Heritage Foundation writes that America must use its arms sales to establish the conditions for the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Middle East. Saudi aid has a massive impact, but Beaumont 18 of the Guardian writes that Saudi Arabia has pledged over $1 billion in humanitarian aid alongside the UAE to alleviate conditions in Yemen. Thus, Arab News reports this month that Saudi humanitarian aid efforts are set to help an additional $13 million in coming months. Ultimately, Rogan 18 of the Washington Examiner concludes that on its own, Saudi Arabia has deep ideological, historical, and theological motivation to commit to total war in Yemen, and is restrained only by U.S. coverage. Thus,
So your whole case is contingent on the idea that the U.S. no longer has any leverage over Saudi Arabia. So what about the other aspects of the Saudi-U.S. alliance, other than arms sales? For example, we protect Saudi Arabia's livelihood when we protect our oil fields from terrorist groups, rebel groups, other countries. What happens to that?
Saudi Arabia, the Saudis, their alliance is solely based on arms sales.
Why? No, let me get into that. Why?
Because it provides them support and the U.S.
Okay, so yeah, arms sales are important. What about the other aspects, like protecting their entire economy through protecting their oil fields from terrorist groups, rebel groups, other countries?
We would say that's not a key part of it. No.
Why?
Can you tell me
I'm telling you it is a very key part of their country, not their military alliance, but their country as a whole. Because if their oil fields are not protected, they cannot like sell oil at the amount, at the price they want, or to who they want. So for that reason, because their economy is based on oil, the U.S. is very important to Saudi Arabia, even without arms sales. Why are you disagreeing? Okay, cool.
So, your entire case is based on the fact that President and if Saudi Arabia doesn't have arms sales, right?
No.
What is this?
Our last link, I think, what you're referring to, the Yemen argument, is not that the Yemen war will end necessarily, it's that the suffering in Yemen will be greatly mitigated, and the reason behind that is because like the bombs that are used to airstrike, the planes that are used to airstrike American post-war blockade.
Weapons and arms sales to like continue their offensive in Yemen, does that mean you actually stall back from like mitigating like?
Who saw that? What are you talking about?
Like, does ending arms sales actually do anything if they still have weapons?
Yeah. The reason behind that, are you talking about like a stockpile?
Sure. Or they can get stuff like from the other Western countries, like countries.
Other Western countries? So I can just like respond to this already now. So the West, like Europe, like a bunch of countries in Europe, like Germany and the UK, have already denounced arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But second of all, we would argue that if the US ends arms sales to Saudi Arabia over their human rights abuses, the rest of the Western world will probably follow because they see a lot of backlash if they didn't. Second of all, if you're talking about Russia, you're talking about that would take way too long, a lot of money as is the case. And third of all, if you're talking about the stockpile, the argument here is really simple. You need continual maintenance, continual support of the United States. And if they have a stockpile, they're not just going to use all their weapons if they know that it's a finite amount because the U.S. is no longer supporting them. So, back to your case. On your second link, you tell me that there are windows of aid. So if there are windows of aid, but even if some aid is getting in, and the Saudis are like bombing like infrastructure that is like creating long-term famines, then how is this like long-term solvency? That was a little messy. That's my question.
We would say the current negotiations have like minimized Saudi airstrikes significantly.
That's important.
But then.
So the current. Let me get in there real quick. The current negotiations are ending airstrikes in Hodeidah, not the rest of the city. The most important part for famines is the rest of the infrastructure.
And then second, you would say that like it's decreasing a lot. Like
what's decreasing that?
You would say that's like
I'm saying that the Saudi airstrikes are bombing infrastructure that creates long-term famines. Those are still happening across the country, even if they're not happening in one city, Hodeidah.
We would say the U.S. Russia is actually allowing for aid to follow through when it happened.
Only in Hodeidah.
Can I see the Wall Street Journal on this about the latest one? Second one. Yeah.
Wait, Brian, which? So we used 35 total.
So the first thing my opponents talk about is two reasons why the war is going to continue in Yemen. The first is about the UAE. There's a couple issues here. The first is that Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Gulf states. Specifically, they're the leader of the coalition that is going after Yemen. If Saudi Arabia were to significantly decrease its military power in the region, it would give a strong incentive for the UAE to do the same in the rest of the coalition, given that Saudi Arabia is a leader of the coalition and essentially tells them what to do in the region. But second, according to the UN, Saudi airstrikes are causing most of the Yemeni child deaths in the region, and I'll get to the reasons behind that later. In fact, what the UN specifically indicates is that ground troops are causing the second most, and according to Griffin of the UN, Saudi Arabia is the one who is doing all of the aerial bombings on Yemen, while the UAE is involved on the ground. That's going to be incredibly important, because even if the UAE continues to do whatever whatever they want, there's still comparatively less civilian casualties in the affirmative world. Then, their second warrant talks about economic leverage, but that doesn't mean that you can't limit suffering in the affirmative world. Just because Saudi Arabia denies some people salaries does not mean that if we took away their airstrikes that less people would die. Does not mean that if we took away their boats, more people would have aid because of the blockade. This is not a reason. It is not terminal defects on our case. Let's go to the next evidence, which says this is the link to their entire case. It is that the U.S. gets leverage over Saudi Arabia. The problem here comes from Tessman in 2010, who explains that states who receive military aid in alliances with the United States are less likely to cooperate with the United States empirically. The reasoning is, when states receive U.S. military support, they get the mindset that the U.S. relies on them for their economics, and they also rely on them for some sort of regional security. And that has happened in Saudi Arabia, which is why Ibish in 2018 explains, and Danny was getting to this in Crossfire, that because there's so many other things that hold our alliance together in terms of geopolitical interest in Iran, and also Saudi's importance of their oil fields, it would, if we sent them a signal that they had to pay back for Khashoggi's killings and limit the war in Yemen, it could make our relationship even stronger, because it would show that we are not just going to be a completely willing ally to give them whatever they want. Then, that's the link to their case, so if that's done, their whole case is done. Let's go to their warrants anyway. So, the first one talks about decreasing the amount of civilian strikes, but according to the Human Rights Watch, Saudi Arabia has regularly targeted weddings, funerals, and in August of 2018, they bombed a school bus full of young kids. Their evidence from Hartoon says that they got $700 million in retraining. That literally means nothing. The U.S. can tell Saudi Arabia what to do. Saudi Arabia never does it. Millions of people are dying. We cannot wait any longer. But then they say this card that thousands more would be dead without it. This card is purely rhetorical. There's no methodology behind it. It's just some right-wing politician who wants money for the military saying it. Most importantly, right, at the point where they're bombing civilians in the status quo, you know that the only risk of solvency is the affirmative world. The second thing they talk about is letting aid through. They talk about the ceasefire as per their Rogan evidence. But that's not the reason why Saudi Arabia is going in for the ceasefire. According to Al Jazeera, Saudi Arabia uses these ceasefires as a break from fighting, where they continue to bomb other areas in Yemen, and it looks good for them in the political short term, and it justifies their expansion in the long term. In fact, during the ceasefire alone, there have been over 500 violations of the ceasefire, which is why Ira News in February of 2019 explains that aid needs in Yemen are going up, not down in the status quo. Look to the holistic view, not just one city alone. But then they say that they've allowed aid to flow in, but the UN themselves have said that they're not getting enough aid to help as many people as they want to. In fact, there's a ton of grain silos in Yemen right now, which are rotting because they can't get to them and they can't deliver to the people. Millions of people's lives are on edge. But then they say that short-term spikes are really important. But Feldman 18 explains that the negotiations that even they talk about are still not an effective solution because they take too long, and every 10 minutes one Yemeni child dies. That's why our case is a prerequisite. In fact, Bridgman of NYU explains that because they rely on us for maintenance and technical support, if we cut off arms sales, their aircrafts would be grounded immediately. Let's go to their third one, where they say U.S. leverage across the Middle East. Remember that the blockade of Hodeidah keeps going today. They stopped it one time in 2017, but it's still happening. And then all of Saudi's humanitarian aid is just political. It's just political facades to increasingly do their work in Yemen. The Maxwell evidence in our case says that Saudi Arabian airstrikes create long-term famine conditions for 20 million people by bombing food supplies and transportation, and aid cannot get to the country. Let's stop the fighting and affirm.
Is everyone ready? I'm gonna frontline my own case first. Time starts now. Let's go to where he says we have other forms of leverage. He says that when we give military aid to countries, they're less likely to cooperate because it goes to their head and become arrogant. Two responses here. What Landell says right now is for the Khashoggi killing, Trump has stepped up pressure on Saudi Arabia, and to the extent where Saudi Arabia will only believe America always has their back, but America is telling them to continue expansion, we would say that the opposite is true right now. America is specifically cracking down on Saudi Arabia and making things like contingent. For example, the House passed a bill that literally ends arms sales 2 days ago, putting pressure on Saudi Arabia. But secondly, more importantly, they talk about economic leverage. There's two responses here. First is the USA Today evidence that says as a result of the Khashoggi killing, companies from America are already leaving the region from Saudi Arabia, and as a result our economies are less interdependent, so we have less economic leverage anymore. But secondly, and more importantly, we would say that the economy doesn't matter to Saudi Arabia in terms of leverage because America will never use it. America is simply not going to threaten the oil in the region because America needs that oil to survive as well. America will never pressure that to the extent we're using leverage. That's why America has never imposed things like sanctions on on Saudi Arabia, this definitely doesn't apply to our case. Go to our third one about Saudi initiatives. He only reads two responses here. First, he says the blockade was only opened once. A, we tell you that was directly because of U.S. pressure and millions were able to get access to aid, but also our link is not about the blockade. The Miller evidence says that as a result of U.S. leverage, Saudi Arabia has pledged to actually give aid to these countries in Yemen. The Beaumont 18 evidence says they pledged $1 billion in aid to help Yemen, and as a result, the Arab News from 2019 says that 2.5 million people have already been helped and 13 more million people will be helped in the coming months. They say that it's a political facade. The Arab News evidence tells you that 2.5 million people have already been helped in the status quo. Let's go to their case. Their entire case is contingent on Saudi Arabia losing their weapons when you affirm. There's two reasons this is false. The first is when Knights 18 says that Saudi Arabia has years of stockpiles and continue bombing no matter what, even if we ended all arms sales now. Indeed, the warrant comes from Times from 2018 that says that Saudi Arabia has already purchased 60% of the weapons they need to continue operations for the next 10 years, which means that no matter what, they're always going to be able to continue this proxification of conflict and continue expansion in Yemen. But secondly, more importantly, what Clayton 19 says is that Saudi Arabia's military relies on private military contractors for logistics, equipment, maintenance, and all these things. That's their own link. The problem is this doesn't go away. We vote out because what Paretsky writes is that multinational PMCs manipulate export laws, like when we end arms sales, to continue selling to Saudi Arabia. They instead go through things like subsidiaries. Indeed, Operelli 18, and this is the most empirical analysis, says that when Germany ended arms sales in the last year, these German private military contractors instead switched to Italian subsidiaries and continued selling to Saudi Arabia. That's terminal defense on their case. Saudi Arabia will always have weapons and will always continue expansion as a result. But third, they talk about a regional conflict. They're going to stand up later and say they outweigh because they talk about more conflicts. But we link in with our case too with leverage. Because what Miller 18 says is the result of U.S. leverage on Saudi Arabia with arms sales. They've increased aid to the entire region, including $500 million to Syria. Let's go to their individual links. Their first link is about military proxy forces. Two responses here. First, we would say that the arms and the money that are given to these proxy groups are not like the large-scale ballistic missiles, but rather small arms such that they can buy from literally anyone. It doesn't take decades to switch to buy a couple of new guns from Russia. They can keep giving to these groups. But secondly, that's why Chazgreen says that Russia is already selling arms to Saudi Arabia. But secondly, more importantly, we would say that if you end your direct ability to engage in conflict, that incentivizes them to give money to proxy groups instead, which probably means that indeed proxy wars are going to get worse. Their second link is about moderation. But again, we would say that U.S. leverage is going to check back for this because what Rogan 18 says is that we're pressuring Saudi Arabia in the status quo to engage in consistent amounts of stability and ensure they're not killing as many civilians. But secondly, more importantly, this link concedes the leverage argument because this link says that they're afraid that it's based on U.S. protection, and if arms sales go away, they lose that U.S. protection, which means that it's not just about broader military alliances, because ending arms sales is a signal of our commitment. Go to the third link about Yemen. What Johnson 16 says is that even if you end the Houthi-Saudi Arabia conflict, that local groups are only going to fracture, and as a result, they're going to fight each other, increasing the conflict. The Johnson evidence says the war is only going to get worse when the Saudi-Houthi conflict is resolved. That's a turn on their case. Ready for cross?
Can I see any evidence of export laws that are specific to U.S.
Yeah.
So, your big terminal defense is that PMCs can manipulate export laws, right?
Yep.
So, when did U.S. face PMC?
I can give you a lot of examples. One, with South Africa in the 1980s, America banned and sanctioned arms sales against South Africa. American multinational PMCs proceeded to use subsidiaries and continue selling. That's an example. Sandy, my question, like arms.
What?
What do you mean? The type they sell right now?
So they're selling F-15 fighter jets to South Africa in the 80s?
Well, I mean, I don't think we had F-15 fighter jets.
Maybe like F-11s.
Yeah, maybe something like that. Can I have a question? Okay, so let's talk about like your response to my case at the top, where you say that like if Saudi Arabia leaves, then that would tell the UAE to stop. So why is the UAE intervening in Yemen right now?
And there's a bunch of reasons.
Like, right, and it's not because Saudi Arabia one day was like, hey, we want you to invade Yemen.
I mean, our argument is that they work together on a lot of logistical support,
Yeah,
and
sure.
they have some of the same war aims. And Saudi Arabia is a leader in the Middle East, specifically among Gulf states,
Yeah.
which one includes the UAE.
Sure.
So even if the UAE doesn't stop all this fighting, there's a risk that they do in our world,
Wait,
and there's no
what is-
risk that they do in your world.
What does that mean? There's a risk they're going to. You don't give me a single reason why
I
like
did.
the UAE here. And so Saudi Arabia is going to leave, like not by their own choice, but because they don't have arms. So then the UAE is going to be like, oh, Saudi Arabia left. I guess that means that we need to leave too, even though
It's
we have
not-
strategic
that's not a-
interests
it's not like
and
Saudi
like
Arabia
problems in
and
the
UAE.
region, right?
It's not, first of all, Saudi Arabia and the UAE share a big interest and they both want to counter Iran. Like they're
Right.
both
So
Gulf states
why,
coalition
exactly.
Iran.
So
Yeah.
why would the UAE give up
If
on
Saudi-
countering
if
Iran
Saudi
in
Arabia,
Yemen?
if Saudi Arabia decreases their support to Yemen and they say it's probably not going well for us or you, we should stop.
So the UAE is just going to be like, oh yeah, Iran, you can take over Yemen because our friends over there, Saudi Arabia, decided they didn't want to fight anymore.
Or if it's pretty clear that the war is not working to contain Iran.
Wait, is the
there's
war
still-
working right now to contain Iran? Like your
No.
case would posit that's not true, correct?
Yes, exactly.
So-
So if Saudi Arabia
so
leaves a war
then why
that's
haven't they
failing,
left
the UAE
already?
is all
If the war is already
because we keep
failing, then
giving
why
them
haven't they
arms,
left?
Because the war
But
is
you just
failing.
told me that it's a perception that the war is failing without Saudi Arabia that will cause them to leave.
No.
Right?
It's when Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Gulf coalition. Again, we're not saying there's a 100% probability they leave. There's
Okay,
certainly higher
so
probability they
you have, like-
I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
So when you talk about these local groups will fracture,
Yeah.
so what's going on in Yemen?
What do you mean what's going on in Yemen? Lots going on.
Tons of local groups are already fractured.
No,
In fact,
they're
Saudi
local.
support
Sandy.
has caused them to fracture,
Sandy.
and people are
That's
dying.
not- No, Sandy. The Johnson evidence says that the intervention of Saudi Arabia has united local militias against Houthis who see Saudi Arabia as a common enemy, but they have deep ideological differences with the Houthis and only support them because they don't like getting bombed. Like,
Who
for
supports
example, I don't like the Hajor tribes, for example. There's like
For
10
the
tribes.
Houthis or the Saudi Arabia?
The Hajor tribes are fighting, like right now in the status quo, in relation to the Houthis. We're out of time.
Okay, so let's keep doing.
Okay, so it'll start on their case. Okay, is everybody ready? They need to win one of their first two links. They can see terminal defense on both of them. It's too late to respond to it in second summary. The round is over from their perspective. But then let's go to the link on their whole contention so that there's no more leverage in their world. They have two responses. The first thing is saying they're decreasing support right now, which proves that we're not supporting them. But the Pineda evidence specifically tells you that this decrease in support is fake. All we're doing is stopping refueling of planes. That's not actually necessary. Trump just wants to create the facade of decreasing support. But the Pineda evidence tells you that when we fund their arms sales or when we fund their war, they think that we're supporting their war. Then they tell you that the U.S. would never not not protect their oil fields, two things. First of all, the U.S. is not reliant on Saudi Arabian oil. They never read evidence of that. But second of all, and more importantly, they don't respond to the nuance of the argument. There are a lot of other things that matter. For example, the U.S. helps Saudi Arabia hedge against Iran, which means that you ask yourself a question which is very important in this round. How much does leverage actually go down, and how much does that lead to a decrease in an access in their impact? There's no way to actually contextualize this. There's no way to vote off them. At that point, the only way you could possibly vote for them is their third link about solidifying initiatives. They tell you that they're increasing aid right now in the short term. The problem with this is they drop the Maxwell evidence, which shows that in the long term it's the exact opposite. Because we're continuing Saudi airstrikes by funding their planes and funding their bombs. It's into long-term famine conditions which counteracts their aid. They drop this, don't let them respond to it in second summary. At that point, that's their advocacy for Yemen. Let's look to how we saw it. We tell you from the evidence in our case that when you decrease arms sales, it leads to them not having the capability to bomb Yemen, which means that they don't have these long-term famine capabilities that they talk about. They respond to this by saying that local groups will keep doing it, but it's happening right now. It's not unique. At the top of the case, they give two responses about why we keep having arms. First of all, as a distinction, our second war has nothing to do with the arms, it's about the perception. Then they say that they tell you it's about the stockpile, but Bridgman tells you that they need continual maintenance that takes out that response. Then they tell you that PMCs are going to get around it, but even if that's true, it makes it harder in the short, it makes it harder even a little bit for them to give arms sales to Saudi Arabia. At that point, the second link is completely independent, where we tell you from the FNAIT evidence that the leverage is not working, because when we give Saudi Arabia arms, it makes them feel invincible, because we're giving them the green light to commit these atrocities. That's what the previous evidence which they drop specifically tells you, that when you support countries with arms sales by 1%, it leads to a 21% increase on conflict starting, because these countries feel invincible. They know that they have the U.S. support. The fake support decreases are not working right now. The only way to decrease Saudi's initiatives is to change what's happening right now, because we tell you that millions of people are dying in the status quo, one child every 10 minutes.
We'll take time being.
Or an army case, they say that a decrease in support is just a facade, but Miller said that, remember, America used their arms to leverage Saudi Arabia to get aid. At that point, that doesn't make sense. But the second, they say America can use other things to leverage, but at first America hasn't used these other things, which means that they're not effective. But then second, they wouldn't use like economic leverage because they understand it's a mutual economic benefit, and they don't give you a single example of America using this other leverage. Like you can't pull out military bases. That's not how it works. At that point, you can clearly go off a third war about aid. They say that they talk about the response he sends is about ceasefires, but we're not talking about ceasefires. We're talking about Saudi Arabia giving aid. Remember, Miller says that U.S. leverages arms sales to make Saudi Arabia cooperate with aid initiatives. Beaumont says that Saudi Arabia has already agreed to for $1 billion of aid, and then Arab News says that this aid has already been given to 2.5 million in the status quo, and it's going to help 13 million in the coming months. We outweigh because they concede the conflict will happen, and the only way to make it better is in our world. But then on their case, they say first they say like you can get weapons from on the PMC terms. Remember, Clayton says that Saudi Arabia relies on PMCs, and they can just, and Kretsky says that the multinational PMCs can just turn to local subsidiaries, and they can manipulate export laws. And remember, currently when Germany ended arms sales, Germany PMCs just turned to Italian subsidiaries, which means that dealing some of their second link. But then go to their second link. They say it's about perception, but first that concedes that ending arms sales ends U.S. leverage. But the second, if they have arms, they're going to feel invincible because they have large amounts of military power. But then go to local groups fraction. They say that local groups are fighting right now, but no, right now they're unified because they use Saudi Arabia as a greater enemy. Johnson says that if you affirm these local coalitions fracture, which means that conflict increases in their world. At that point, and he doesn't even extend an impact, which means you can't vote off that argument. But so at that point, we outweigh because if conflict happens in either world, the only way to actually help people and give them aid is by using U.S. leverage. You can't use leverage if you affirm because ending arms sales ends leverage as they concede. For those reasons, we urge the negative ballot.
Are you all ready?
So, how long would it take, even if your argument is true, how long would it take these PMCs to skirt around export laws and start being based out of another country or
Well, I
initially
mean,
based out of
let's
another
think about
country?
it. When did Germany end arms sales to Saudi Arabia? Last year. Yeah. So they're already doing it. So like.
So it takes a year?
Less than.
So 6 months?
Well, so
I don't know. Like
in
at
terms of-
6 months, 5 months. I guess your impact is that.
Again, in terms of
they
like,
can
if
stop
you want to talk
bombing
about
or-
arms to Saudi Arabia, like a big deal why no one is actually stopping is because the U.S. is essentially getting all the Western world
Wait,
to
no.
like.
What we were talking
So-
about is if a single country in the world has not ended arms sales.
Well, that's not how multinational companies work.
Subsidiary.
That's not true.
You can't have a subsidiary in Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah, okay,
You need to
yes,
have
but
like
you're
a
not like
system
Italy's
set
not
up.
ending arms sales. Like when you vote for AF, Italy's not ending arms sales. Like
But also,
UK's
like-
not ending arms sales. Like
Well,
those are
UK
climate
is ending
countries.
arms sales right now.
The UK is not ending arms sales right now.
They
The
announced it
losing
publicly.
party wants to
Well,
end arms
again,
sales.
right? Like even like the U.S. has the most weight in the international community. There's a risk that there's
What
definitely a
does
risk
this
on
mean?
some.
Like, what is there's a risk that every Western
Because
nation in the
like-
world will follow America
That's not
and
the
end
argument.
arms
No,
sales?
that's not our argument. Our argument is that is very simple. Yes, the war will probably continue, but you limit the suffering by stopping selling them arms like bombs and planes. Let me get to your
Yes, go
point.
ahead.
We tell you that even if some multinational companies aren't able to find subsidiaries, even if it takes a year, 6 months, 5 months, whatever you said, that's some mitigation. And because one child is dying every 10 minutes, that mitigation is very, very important.
Wait. I'm still like really confused, right?
Why?
Like, so you would rather stop fighting for like 3 months or so in exchange with stopping like aid inflows from Saudi Arabia that's helping 13 million people
yeah,
in
we
the next
would.
coming months.
Yeah, we would.
So wait, okay.
And the
So
reason
I'm
behind
now
it-
really confused. So
okay,
your
Ryan,
impact is
Ryan,
a
again, you can say
3-month
you're
long
confused
stop in
as much
like
as you want.
conflict.
You can say you're confused as much as you want. But again, you drop the terminal defense on your third impact.
Where?
Just take the Maxwell evidence, man.
That's not ceasefires.
No, I didn't say the word ceasefire in
Okay,
second.
There's a long-term failure
Let
of
me explain it. Let me
ceasefire.
Long-term
explain it.
failure,
Okay.
not
Let me
failure.
explain it. I'm gonna explain it.
Yeah, we can give
Right,
aid,
right,
then
right.
we don't have family because they
Hey,
Alright,
so let me explain it how I vote and final vote. The Maxwell.
I want you to explain it in summary, not in final opinion. I want some new thing in final
I'll say
opinion.
racism.
You do new things.
Uber family.
Yes, I'm listening. I'm listening.
Alright, Maxwell evidence, right? It says that because of Saudi Arabia's air campaign, what they're bombing is civilian infrastructure, like the food supplies and aid infrastructure, the way they're getting it through. So even if they do these like political facades in the short term, where we give a lot of people
political
in the
facades?
long term,
2.5 million people.
Well, 2.5
What does
million out
political
of
facade mean?
2.5 million out of the 20 million that are starving.
And
right now.
13 more million in the coming months. Like,
Well,
yeah, we
we
didn't
don't
drop
know why
all
that's
the aid at once. It's a long-term
We don't know
investment.
if that's true.
Yeah,
13
again,
million is
yeah.
kind of just a random number.
Like you're just saying,
It's a
It's just a
you're just
random
saying,
projection.
your evidence is like, this is how much money they're pledging, and based if everything goes well, this is how many people it can support.
Well,
If
yeah,
they continue
guys,
to
50
bomb the whole
versus-
region, no one gets that
Wait,
support. That's
no.
why every
You can't
year you
give
have
aid
these
in conflicts that are the same.
It's gonna start on their case. Everyone's ready? Let's start on their case. Their internal to this entire argument is that U.S. leverage goes entirely away in the affirmative world. Here's why that's wrong. Shreya says two things in summary, no new things from Ryan, and second final focus, please. First is that we're giving aid in the status quo, so that's leverage. But we say it's a short-term political part where Saudi Arabia always says we're going to increase aid for 2.5 million people, have a lot of money in the region while they continue to bomb the entire region. That's why every single year, one Yemeni child dies every single 10 minutes. There's literally no way to vote for them. But second, they say that the U.S. will never use the leverage over Saudi Arabia. This does not respond to our Abish evidence or the Tanate evidence, which tells you that the alliance will still stand because the things they talk about are mutually beneficial, which means that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia always have an incentive to work together, whether it's economic like they say, or it's geopolitical like we say, which means that the leverage does not go away. At best, this is severe mitigation on their case because the leverage did not entirely go away. You have no clue how much leverage actually decreases and how much aid actually decreases in their case. But then, on their warrant about aid, they just extend two numbers, but we tell you that it's a political farce in the short term, as Danny explains in summary. In the long term, the Maxwell evidence tells you that the airstrikes are creating long-term famine conditions. Their case is essentially saying, yes, Saudi Arabia, bomb whoever you want, but also maybe give them food after. How about we stop bombing? How about we stop the one Yemeni child dying every 10 minutes? That's why we outweigh on urgency and uniqueness. They can see the ceasefire is failing, everything is failing, their case is failing. Let's go back to our case. They extend a couple of things. The first is that they can manipulate export laws. The FSA shows is just one example of South Africa and Germany turning to Italy. We say that there's definitely at best, there's definitely a scope of time, 6 months, a year, where they have to relocate, which is live safe, but also there's definitely a risk that the United States can help pressure support from the entire West. They don't give any real terminal defense here. It's at best very, very mitigatory. But then, let's go to our second warrant. They just say that arms lead to a large, power, but it's about a less willing U.S. partner. The Jones and Panay evidence tells you that a less willing United States partner will reign in Saudi Arabia across the Middle East, decreasing process count by 20%. That weighs down scope because now we're affecting outside of Yemen. Lastly, on local groups, we tell you they're happening in the status quo. The Bridgman evidence said that if they don't have the spare parts, their air force is grounded, millions of lives are saved. Vote for what you know and vote affirmative.
It's very good at those little things at the end.
Is everyone ready? Time starts now. Sandeep says to vote for what you know. So let's talk about what we know. Go to our third contention about aid. They say a few things. First, they say it's a short-term farce. I don't know what this means. What Ray tells you specifically is you're consistently pressuring for aid in the region to help 13 million in the coming months. 2.5 million have already been helped. If that's short-term aid, we would say that that's 13 million people on the brink of starvation we're giving aid to. Then they say that they say this evidence that says the alliance is still going to stand is the things that are mutually beneficial. The point of this is exactly what Ray tells you. We'll never use the other forms of leverage because they're mutually beneficial. That's why America has never done any other form of leverage. It tells you that we're never going to use things like economic leverage, which means that arms sales are the only way to do so. Then they say it's a political farce and long-term ceasefires fail. Let's talk about the long-term. What we are saying is we're consistently giving them aid and basic access to food and water. Australia extends the weighing free that's dropped. It says if a conflict is always going to happen, it's better that people actually have food and water so they can continue surviving. Then most people are dying from starvation, not from direct airstrikes. Let's go go to their case, there is simply too much dropped defense for you to even consider voting for them. First is the idea of subsidiaries and PMCs. The Clayton evidence says that Saudi Arabia entirely relies on PMCs in the status quo. The Peretz evidence says it's really easy for these multinational PMCs to manipulate export laws to continue selling. They say it's one example, it's literally not. The evidence says that multinationals are consistently able to do this. In fact, we give you that for the example that they asked for. The Borelli evidence from 2018 says that Germany literally ended arms sales. They went to Italy as a subsidiary, kept selling. That's terminal defense in their case. It's what Australia tells you. They always have the arms. They always feel invincible because they always think they can continue expansion with large amounts of military power. Then they say the entire West is just going to follow American end arms sales. A, new and final focus, Sandeep. But B, what we tell you specifically is that there's no probability whatsoever of this happening. But more importantly, on their actual impact, what Johnson says is drop terminal defense. They just say it's happening now that local groups are fracturing. That's not true. Australia tells you that right now they're unified because they become an enemy of Saudi Arabia. When the Saudi-Houthi conflict ends, that means they fracture, fight against each other, and violence only increases. That's terminal defense in their case, and that's why you negate it.